Aaron, there's a lot of discussion, really, whether it be pop culture books or psychology books or business books that talk about your perception is your reality. So
Right.
how you perceive your circumstances is what's real to you. Through the course of several of our discussions, we've laid in this idea that you need to core your core to find your bedrock. To really unearth 5 levels deep at least why we make the decisions we do, to understand at the end of the day what our motivators are and what our true beliefs and core values are, to help set us up to make choices for business or personal life that ultimately are correctly aligned with this bedrock.
Right.
Right. That means we have to own it. So we talk a little bit about our problems get smaller when we own the mountain.
Right.
If I'm understanding that correctly, if I understand what my bedrock is, what my core beliefs are, I understand I'm the only one who can now make practical changes to my business model, my team structure, my career, my family life, anything to make sure I'm actually working towards actualizing these bedrock beliefs.
Right.
Right. And so when I think about that, I have so many examples of folks who are close to me who are in total inner conflict because they're chasing owning a business, but are still working within an organization and are blaming their circumstances, the corporation, the economy, a whole bunch of things. But the conflict is they have not found their bedrock.
Right.
So while this inner conflict continues, their problems are almost insurmountable. And as I look back, I can feel with my own journey, as I've been able to quieten that conflict by lining up how I spend my days personally and professionally with my bedrock, my problems have really got a lot smaller. And I'm trying to think, Aaron, because you're so good with really putting it into life perspective. For those listeners out there who are still raging with that inner conflict, right, and don't own their mountain yet,
Right.
how can they go about trying to acquire their mountain so their problems are a little less noisy?
That's a great question. It's a great question. So I'm going to give you 2 stories, which hopefully it touches on answering, and you'll tell me if it does or doesn't, and we'll drill in further if we need to. But essentially, so the one is just an analogy, sort of a metaphor, which you might have heard the story before, where it talks about the jar, a full jar, where essentially a professor walks up in front of the classroom and puts a glass jar in front and says, "Is this jar full?"
Yep.
And the class looks and everybody raises their hand and says no. So he takes big chunks of stones and put the big stones in, and he says, and he fills it to the top, and he says, "Is this full?" So most people put up their hand. And he says, "No, it's not full," because then he takes like smaller stones and he puts it in the jar and they fall between the big stones. And then he says, "Now is it full?" And so the students catch on.
Right.
And the process goes on that he takes sand and that falls in. And then finally he fills it up with water. And so the analogy that he's bringing across is actually one of priorities, because the question then posed was like, if I filled it first up with sand, I wouldn't be able to get the big stones in there. And so the reason I say that is because if we think of the sand as our problems, the small problems, if we focus all the way on the small problems, there's not going to be time to focus on the bigger priorities. So the message in this is really gaining perspective. And I think if you focus on what's important, then the problems become smaller. So if, like you're saying, if you own the mountain, in my mind, it's like if you own your vision, if you own your reality, if you focus on the priorities in your life, then all this stuff becomes much smaller, the sand, and you're not going to leave much space for it. But if it's reverse, if you're focusing on everything else, if you don't have a clear sense of your priorities and you're focusing on the sand, there's not going to be time for the bigger priorities in your life.
Right.
And so I'll try and relate it to something which is this principle applied from a personal experience within when we are growing our company. But it's just the sense of having the right perspective and the belief in yourself that really can make a fundamental difference in the outcome. And so I remember back on the early days when we were first selling our software, and we were struggling to get $5,000, $10,000 a year for the software, and we were doing everything. We just felt so insecure that there was all these bugs in the system, right? And so that's why we just didn't feel like we could charge more for it, because there was still so much that needed to be worked out. These were little things from the font was not right, or the spelling mistakes here and there, but nothing material. But that's where our focus was, and it was all these minor details, and it just led to us having this insecurity about the product, affecting our beliefs and affecting the worth of the product, and therefore our ability to sell it and how much we could sell it for. If I fast forward a few years, the same product, fundamentally the same product, where the foundation was the same, or 80-90% of the foundation was the same, we were then selling it for millions of dollars a year. So when you think about that, 1 year you're selling it for $5,000, $10,000. A few years later, you're selling the same thing for millions of dollars a year. And fundamentally, the product didn't change. So what changed? Well, what changed was our mindset and our belief and our understanding in the product. So it was interesting because we got comfortable with the fact that, hey, not every solution has to be perfect,
Right.
nor is every solution perfect, because perfect is the lowest standard, right? Because you can never be perfect.
So you know what, it's interesting, and I'm trying to kind of reframe this, because I think this what we're saying is we have to own our frame of mind.
Yes.
Buy your mountain,
Yes.
right? And how you get there, we're either going to do the marathon approach or the sprinting approach, but buy your mountain.
Yes.
And when you're there, from a business standpoint, and for so many of our listeners out there who are either early stage in business, startup, or looking to go into a new sector of the market in a given service or product or technology, MVP, you and I talk a lot about MVP,
100%, yes.
minimally viable product. And if you take that approach, I own my mountain, so my vision is clear, it aligns with my beliefs, and I've got a long-range passion to perform on that. MVP means I am not going to get lost in the weeds.
Right. Those are the big stones.
Right.
MVP are the big stones.
So now my jar is not completely filled of sand or these small problems,
Right.
But really it's keeping my eye on what's minimally viable, because my belief is so strong, I know there's a market potential out there for me.
Right.
And I think a great lesson in that is we only have to look at Apple, right?
Right.
Early days of Apple, they were not the best computers out there in the world, not by a long shot, but MVP was their mantra, or version of MVP. And look at Apple today.
No, absolutely. And there's so many examples of that. And that's absolutely the point we're touching on. MVP, which in my mind is those big stones, right? And getting
Yes.
clear on what those big stones are. And there's work in that, because when it comes to
Yeah.
releasing a product, you have to understand your market, really get in the hearts and minds of your clients,
Right.
know what they want, know how you're going to solve the problem for them.
Yes.
And once you know that, you solve 80-20 of the problem. It's the 20% that's going to solve 80% of their problem. So that's the MVP.
Right.
It's when you get lost in the details, the
100%.
sand, that people get distracted,
Right.
and it's very difficult to differentiate yourself. So that's absolutely the principle we're touching on. And that's the example that I used from our standpoint. It's what led us to be able to get millions of dollars a year for the product versus 5,000. It's the focus on the MVP, the elements that were important to people,
Right.
and not losing confidence and being insecure about the other stuff that might not work as well
Yes.
as we would, because that wasn't important to the customer. That was the big mindset shift that we had, just being able to focus on what's important.
Right. Even if we come back to communication, it's such a key component of success in any business build, sales cycle, or team development, that we sometimes create our own small problems. What I mean by that is if we have a team who's not focused on MVP, given it as a product, a service that we're being offered, and as things come up, if we give the wrong attention to different complaints being bubbled up, and we all know folks are naturally phenomenal at pointing out what's not working versus what is, or how to make something that's not
Right,
working
that's
work.
the broken tile syndrome. Right?
Complete
Yeah.
the broken tile syndrome. So I would also caution all of our listeners out there, as much as you and I need to remind one another of this. Don't get sucked into the small problems, because those small problems will very quickly sabotage that MVP approach and take away that ownership of the next set of goals out there.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing to that, and that this is something we have to train our minds to, because this broken tile syndrome, this is a phenomenon that everybody experiences. We gravitate to problems and looking for what's wrong and stuff, and we have to train ourselves. Before you think of or say anything negative, you got to train yourself to let me look for the positive.
Right.
And that's a discipline you got to build in yourself. Always look for the positive,
Right.
and instill in yourself, I'm only going to focus on 3 positives before I can point out a negative. It's such a simple rule, but it'll fundamentally change how you look at your employees, look at your company, can focus on the MVP and identify what those big stones are, and not get distracted by the little stones.
Absolutely. One final thought as we wrap up, because the broken tile syndrome is something you've helped me with. And I think about for most of us out there who really are highly competitive, top performers, goal-orientated, we tend to be perfectionists.
Right.
Right. And I think of my first house I bought in Canada. The house was magnificent. It was brand new build. It was gorgeous. And the only thing I could see was where the paint wasn't perfectly tying up on the corner, on the crown molding with the wall. And I walked around the house making a list of where all there were these paint errors or nail pops. That really is the broken tile issue.
Right.
And in life, we can be stuck on those broken tiles, or in business. And to your point, if we do that, the sand's filled up the jar, we will lose our MVP, and we have at stake that mountain that we've laid claim to.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said.